The morning sun was just breaking through the hangar doors when Jerome clocked in at Premier Aviation Services. 3 years he'd been working here, and every day still felt like a privilege. Growing up in the projects, he never imagined he'd be working on million-dollar aircraft. But here he was, wrench in hand and grease under his nails. Jerome had always been good with his hands. As a kid, he'd take apart anything he could find. Old radios, broken fans, even his grandmother's toaster once, much to her dismay. She'd scold him, but deep down, she was proud. Not many kids from their neighborhood showed that kind of curiosity about how things worked. After high school, while his friends were heading to college or looking for quick money on the streets, Jerome enrolled in technical school. It wasn't glamorous, but he had a vision. He wanted to work on something bigger than fixing cars in someone's driveway. He wanted to work on machines that could fly. The aviation program was tough. Long nights studying hydraulic systems, electrical circuits, and engine mechanics. His hands got cut up during practical sessions and his back ached from crawling into tight spaces. But every time he saw a plane take off from the nearby airport, he knew he was on the right path. Premier Aviation Services hired him straight, out of school. It wasn't easy at first. Some of the older mechanics looked at him sideways, wondering if this young guy from the hood could really handle their precious aircraft. But Jerome kept his head down and let his work speak for itself. He showed up early, stayed late, and never complained about the dirty jobs nobody else wanted. His supervisor, Rodriguez, was a fair man who judged people by their work, not their background. Over time, Jerome proved himself. He had an eye for detail that impressed everyone. He could spot problems other mechanics missed, and his repairs always held up perfectly. This particular Tuesday started like any other. Jerome was drinking his coffee and checking the work orders for the day when Rodriguez called him over to the office. "Got something special for you today," Rodriguez said, sliding a clipboard across his desk. "That beauty over there." He pointed through the window at a sleek white aircraft that had arrived the night before. Jerome whistled low. It was a Gulfstream G650, one of the most expensive private jets money could buy. The kind of plane that cost more than most people would make in several lifetimes. "Routine maintenance?" Jerome asked, scanning the paperwork. "That's what the owner requested," Rodriguez said. "But you know how it is with these luxury birds. Once you start looking, you usually find more than you bargained for." Jerome nodded. Rich folks often flew their planes hard and expected them to run perfectly without proper upkeep. They'd skip scheduled maintenance and then act surprised when something broke down. "Whose plane is it?" Jerome asked. Not that it really mattered. Rich was rich. Victoria Sterling. You know, the tech lady. Made her fortune with that app everyone uses for food delivery. Jerome had heard of her. Her face was always in business magazines, and she'd been in the news recently for buying some fancy mansion. But to him, she was just another client. His job was to make sure her plane was safe and airworthy, nothing more. He walked over to the aircraft, running his hands along the smooth fuselage. Even sitting still, it looked fast. The paint job was flawless, and the interior, visible through the small windows, looked more like a luxury hotel room than an airplane cabin. Jerome started with his standard inspection routine. He checked the tires, examined the landing gear, and looked over the external surfaces for any signs of wear or damage. Everything looked good from the outside, but that didn't mean much. The real work happened when you got under the hood. Popping open the engine compartment, Jerome immediately noticed something that made him frown. One of the oil lines showed signs of seepage. Not enough to ground the plane immediately, but definitely something that needed attention. He made a note on his clipboard and kept looking. The more he examined, the more problems he found. A hydraulic fitting was loose. Some electrical connections looked corroded. The air filter needed replacing. It was clear this plane hadn't received proper maintenance in months, maybe longer. Jerome shook his head. People with this much money, and they couldn't be bothered to take care of a $40 million aircraft. It was like buying a Ferrari and never changing the oil. He called Rodriguez over to show him what he'd found. His supervisor looked at the list and whistled. "Looks like you're going to be busy for a while," Rodriguez said. "Think you can handle it?" "Give me 2 days," Jerome said confidently. "I'll have her purring like a kitten." The first major problem was a seized component in the engine's accessory section. Jerome had encountered this before on older aircraft, but never on something this expensive. The part was stuck tight, corroded in place by months of neglect. Jerome gathered his tools and got to work. The component was in an awkward position, requiring him to squeeze into a tight space between the engine and the aircraft's frame. He had to use all his strength to break the corroded fitting free, his muscles straining against the stubborn metal. This was the part of his job Jerome actually enjoyed most. Not the easy stuff, but the challenging repairs that required both brains and brawn. He'd learned over the years that being strong wasn't just about lifting heavy things. Sometimes you needed that strength for precision work, holding steady pressure while making delicate adjustments. Sweat began to bead on his forehead as he worked. The hangar was warm, and the physical effort of the repair was demanding. He'd taken off his outer shirt, working in just his undershirt to stay cool. His grandmother had always said he got his build from his grandfather, a man who'd worked construction his whole life and stayed strong well into his 70s. Jerome was completely focused on the task at hand, the way he always was when working on a difficult problem. He had that rare ability to block out everything else and concentrate entirely on what was in front of him. It was one of the things that made him such a good mechanic. The seized component finally gave way with a satisfying crack. Jerome smiled, to himself, pleased that his persistence had paid off. He carefully removed the old part, examining it in the light. Just as he'd suspected, it was completely corroded and would need to be replaced. As he emerged from under the engine compartment, tools in hand and satisfaction on his face, Jerome had no idea that someone had been watching him work. He was thinking about the next phase of the repair, mentally cataloging what parts he'd need to order and how long each step would take. He loved this feeling, the satisfaction of diagnosing a complex problem and knowing exactly how to fix it. It was what had drawn him to this work in the first place and what kept him motivated even on the toughest days. Jerome wiped his hands on a rag and made another note on his clipboard. This was going to be a good day. He had challenging work ahead of him, and he was confident he could get this beautiful machine back in perfect flying condition. Little did he know that the real challenge was about to begin, and it would have nothing to do with engines or hydraulics. Jerome was deep into the hydraulic system repair when he heard the sound of expensive heels clicking across the hangar floor. He didn't look up immediately. Rich clients sometimes showed up unannounced to check on their aircraft, and he'd learned it was best to keep working until they actually needed his attention. The clicking stopped near his workstation. Jerome could sense someone standing there, but he was at a critical point in reconnecting a hydraulic line. One wrong move and hydraulic fluid would spray everywhere, making a mess and potentially damaging other components. Almost got it, he muttered to himself, carefully tightening the fitting with just the right amount of pressure. Too loose and it would leak. Too tight and he could crack the fitting entirely. The connection seated perfectly with a satisfying click. Jerome smiled and wiped his hands before finally looking up to see who his visitor was. Standing about 10 feet away was a woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored business suit that probably cost more than Jerome made in a month. She had platinum blonde hair pulled back in a perfect style, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by a professional. Everything about her screamed money and power. This had to be Victoria Sterling, the plane's owner. "Ma'am," Jerome said politely, standing up and grabbing a clean rag to wipe the grease from his hands. "I'm Jerome, the mechanic working on your aircraft. I wasn't expecting you today." She didn't respond right away. Instead, her eyes seemed to be studying him in a way that made Jerome slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual look clients gave him, a mix of curiosity and skepticism about whether this young guy really knew what he was doing. This was different. "I was in the area for a meeting," she finally said, her voice smooth and confident. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things were progressing." "Of course," Jerome said, reaching for his clipboard. "I've identified several issues that need attention. Nothing dangerous, but definitely things that should be addressed before your next flight." He began explaining the problems he'd found, pointing to different parts of the aircraft and describing what needed to be fixed. Jerome took pride in being able to explain complex mechanical issues in terms that non-technical people could understand. It was part of providing good customer service. But as he talked, Jerome noticed that Victoria wasn't really listening to his explanations. Her attention seemed to be focused elsewhere, on his hands as he gestured, on his arms as he pointed to different components, on his face when he looked directly at her while speaking. The hydraulic issue was the most serious, Jerome continued, trying to stay professional. I've replaced the damaged seals and tested the system. Everything's working perfectly now. Victoria said, but Jerome could tell she hadn't heard a word he'd said. You seem to really know what you're doing. Yes, ma'am. I've been working on aircraft for several years now. Your plane should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. No rush, she said, stepping closer. I'm curious. How did you get into this line of work? It must require a lot of physical strength. Jerome felt his jaw tighten slightly. There was something in the way she said physical strength that didn't sit right with him. But he kept his voice steady and professional. I went to technical school after high school, he explained. Always been good with my hands, and I've always been fascinated by how aircraft work. I can see that you're good with your hands, Victoria said. And again there was something in her tone that made Jerome uncomfortable. She walked around to where he'd been working under the engine compartment, examining the tools he'd laid out and the parts he'd removed. Jerome followed, ready to explain what each component was and why it had needed replacement. This must be exhausting work, she said, running her finger along the edge of his workbench. Crawling around in tight spaces, lifting heavy parts. You must work out regularly to stay in such good shape. Jerome felt his cheeks warm slightly. He wasn't used to clients commenting on his physical appearance, and it felt inappropriate. But Victoria Sterling was an important customer, and he didn't want to cause any problems for the shop. The work keeps me pretty active, he said simply, hoping to steer the conversation back to the aircraft. I bet it does, Victoria said, turning to face him directly. You know, I have a gym in my penthouse. Very private, very well equipped. You're welcome to use it any time. Now Jerome was really uncomfortable. That was definitely crossing a line from professional small talk into something personal. He'd dealt with difficult customers before, but nothing quite like this. That's very kind of you, ma'am, but I have a membership at a local gym, Jerome said politely but firmly. Victoria smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Of course you do. I just thought you might enjoy trying some higher-end equipment. My trainer says the machines I have are the best money can buy. She moved closer as she spoke, close enough that Jerome could smell her expensive perfume. He instinctively took a small step back, maintaining professional distance. I should probably get back to work, Jerome said, gesturing toward the aircraft. I want to make sure everything is perfect for your next flight. Such dedication, Victoria said, but she didn't move away. I like that in a man. Tell me, what do you do when you're not fixing airplanes? Jerome wasn't sure how to respond. Personal questions from clients weren't unusual, but something about this conversation felt wrong. The way she was looking at him, the way she kept commenting on his physical appearance, the way she seemed to be ignoring appropriate boundaries. I spend time with my family, Jerome said honestly. Help my grandmother with things around her. House, hang out with friends. No girlfriend? Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. Jerome felt his face get hot. That was definitely not an appropriate question for a client to ask, and he wasn't about to discuss his personal life with someone he'd just met. Ma'am, I really should focus on finishing your aircraft repairs, he said, his tone becoming more formal. Is there anything specific about the maintenance work you'd like to know about? Victoria seemed to realize she'd pushed too far, at least for now. Her smile became more businesslike, though Jerome noticed her eyes still seemed to be evaluating him. No, I trust you know what you're doing, she said. You clearly have very capable hands. There it was again. Another comment that felt loaded with meaning Jerome didn't want to think about. He nodded politely and moved back to his workstation, hoping she would take the hint and leave. But Victoria didn't leave immediately. She lingered, watching him work, making occasional comments that had nothing to do with the aircraft repairs. Jerome tried to focus on his tasks, but he could feel her eyes on him constantly. When she finally left 20 minutes later, Jerome felt like he could breathe again. He'd handled plenty of difficult customers over the years, but this was different. This felt personal in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Jerome tried to shake off the strange encounter and get back to work, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way Victoria had looked at him, the inappropriate questions she'd asked, and the comments about his physical appearance. He'd heard stories from other mechanics about wealthy clients who thought their money gave them the right to treat service workers however they wanted, but he'd never experienced it himself until now. Jerome hoped this was just a one-time thing, that Victoria had satisfied her curiosity and wouldn't be back. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over. Jerome thought Victoria's first visit would be the end of it. He finished her aircraft repairs the next day, did his final inspection, and filled out all the paperwork. The plane was ready to fly, better than it had been in months. He expected Victoria to pick it up and disappear back to her world of board meetings and business deals. He was wrong. Thursday morning, Jerome was working on a different aircraft when he heard those familiar expensive heels clicking across the hangar floor. Again, his stomach dropped. He kept his head down, hoping maybe she was here for someone else, but the footsteps stopped right next to his workstation. "Good morning, Jerome." Victoria's voice was cheerful, almost sing-song. Jerome looked up, forcing a polite smile. "Morning, ma'am. Your aircraft is ready for pickup. All the paperwork is with Rodriguez in the office." "Oh, I know," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm not here about the plane today. I brought you something." She held out a small, elegant bag from what Jerome recognized as an expensive jewelry store downtown, the kind of place he'd never set foot in because a single item probably cost more than his rent. "Ma'am, I can't accept gifts from clients," Jerome said immediately. "Company policy." Victoria laughed, a sound that didn't seem genuine. "It's just a small token of appreciation for your excellent work. I insist." Jerome stepped back slightly. "I really can't. But thank you for thinking of me." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Well, maybe you'll change your mind later. I'll just leave it here on your workbench." She set the bag down despite Jerome's protests. He made a mental note to give it to Rodriguez later, let his supervisor handle returning it to her. "Actually," Victoria continued, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight. I know this wonderful little place downtown. Very private, very intimate." Jerome felt his heart rate pick up, but not in a good way. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of after their last conversation. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that would be appropriate," he said carefully. "I make it a policy not to socialize with clients outside of work." "Oh, come on," Victoria said, moving closer. "We're both adults, and I'd love to get to know you better outside of this noisy hangar." Jerome could smell her expensive perfume again, and it made him feel trapped. He was a big guy, strong enough to handle himself in most situations, but this wasn't about physical strength. Victoria had money, influence, connections. She could make things very difficult for him if she wanted to. "I'm flattered," Jerome lied, "but I really can't. I have family obligations tonight." "What about tomorrow night then?" Victoria asked, not taking the hint. "Ma'am, I think it's best if we keep our relationship professional," Jerome said more firmly. Victoria's expression changed, slightly, a flash of something that might have been annoyance crossing her face before the smile returned. "Of course," she said. "I understand. You're very dedicated to your work." She left after that, but Jerome had a feeling this wasn't over, and he was right. Friday afternoon, Victoria was back. This time she brought coffee, expensive coffee from some fancy shop, for Jerome and a few other mechanics. Most of the guys were thrilled. They'd never had a billionaire buy them coffee before. But Jerome noticed that his cup came with a handwritten note tucked underneath. "Hope you enjoy this, as much as I enjoyed watching you work. V." He threw the note away immediately, but the message was clear. She was still interested, still pursuing him despite his polite rejections. The weekend gave Jerome some relief, but Monday brought more of the same. Victoria found excuses to visit the hangar every few days. Sometimes she claimed she needed to check on something with her aircraft. Other times she said she was considering having other work done, Always she found ways to single Jerome out for conversation. She brought him lunch one day, expensive takeout from a restaurant Jerome had never heard of. When he politely declined, she seemed genuinely confused. "Don't you like good food?" she asked. "I bring my own lunch, ma'am," Jerome explained. "My grandmother makes it for me every morning." "How sweet," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she found it more pathetic than sweet. "You know, I have an excellent chef. He could prepare something special just for you." Jerome was getting tired of having the same conversation over and over. "Ma'am, I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, but I'm not comfortable accepting personal gifts or invitations." "You keep calling me ma'am," Victoria said, stepping closer. "Call me Victoria. We know each other well enough by now, don't you think?" Jerome didn't think they knew each other at all, but he didn't say that. Instead, he focused on organizing his tools, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. But Victoria wasn't giving up easily. She started asking other people about Jerome. Casual questions that seemed innocent enough on the surface but felt invasive to him. She asked Rodriguez about Jerome's work schedule. She asked the other mechanics about his personal life. She even asked the receptionist if Jerome had ever mentioned having a girlfriend. The worst part was that some of his co-workers thought it was great. They'd slap him on the back and make jokes about how lucky he was to have caught the attention of a billionaire. They didn't understand how uncomfortable it made him feel. "Man, you're crazy if you don't take her up on that dinner invitation," his co-worker Danny said one afternoon. "Do you know what her net worth is?" "I don't care what her net worth is," Jerome replied. "She's a client, and I want to keep things professional." "Professional?" Danny laughed. "Brother, she's trying to set you up for life. My wife would kill me if I passed up an opportunity like that." Jerome tried to explain that it wasn't about opportunity. It was about respect and appropriate boundaries, but Danny didn't get it. Most of the guys didn't get it. Things escalated when Victoria started showing up during Jerome's lunch breaks. He usually ate outside on a bench behind the hangar, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. It was his one peaceful moment in the day. Victoria found him there on a Wednesday, carrying her own salad from some upscale place downtown. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, already sitting down before Jerome could answer. Jerome moved over to give her space, but not too much. He didn't want to encourage her by seeming too welcoming. "Beautiful day," Victoria said, picking at her salad. "Yes, ma'am," Jerome agreed, taking a bite of the sandwich his grandmother had made him. "You know, I've been thinking," Victoria said. "I'm having a small gathering at my penthouse this weekend. Just a few close friends. Very casual. You should come." Jerome nearly choked on his sandwich. A party at her penthouse? That was way beyond anything she'd suggested before. "I appreciate the invitation, but I can't," Jerome said. "Why not?" Victoria asked, and there was an edge to her voice now. "Don't you ever do anything fun?" Jerome was getting frustrated. He'd been polite. He'd been professional. He'd tried every gentle way he could think of to make it clear he wasn't interested in anything beyond a working relationship. But Victoria either didn't understand or didn't care. "Ma'am, I've told you. Before, I don't socialize with clients," Jerome said more firmly than he had before. Victoria put down her salad and turned to face him directly. "Jerome, I think you're misunderstanding something here. I'm not just any client. I could do a lot for someone like you." The way she said, "someone like you," made Jerome's blood run cold. He wasn't sure exactly what she meant, but he didn't like the implications. "I'm not looking for anyone to do anything for me," Jerome said, standing up. "I need to get back to work." Victoria stood up too, moving closer to him. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be. I'm offering you opportunities most people would dream of." Jerome looked down at her. This woman who thought her money could buy anything, including him. He realized that no amount of politeness was going to get through to her. She was used to getting what she wanted, and she wasn't used to taking no for an answer. "Ma'am, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can," Jerome said, his voice steady, but firm. "I am not interested in a personal relationship with you. I want to keep things strictly professional. Please respect that." Victoria's face changed completely. The flirtatious smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You know," she said quietly, I spend a lot of money at this facility. I'd hate for that to change because of poor customer service. There it was, the threat Jerome had been expecting. Victoria was making it clear that his job could be at risk if he didn't play along with her games. Victoria's threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jerome felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression calm. He'd heard that tone before, the cold voice of someone who was used to getting their way through intimidation and power. I understand. You're an important client, Jerome said quietly. But that doesn't change my answer. Victoria stared at him for a long moment as if she couldn't believe someone was actually standing up to her. Then her fake smile returned, but her eyes remained cold. We'll see about that, she said, picking up her designer bag. Have a good day, Jerome. After she left, Jerome sat back down on the bench, his sandwich forgotten. His hands were shaking slightly and he realized he'd been holding his breath. This situation was spiraling out of control, and he needed to figure out what to do about it. That afternoon, Jerome started keeping detailed notes about every interaction with Victoria. He wrote down dates, times, what she said, what she brought, him, how she acted. His grandmother had always told him to document everything when dealing with difficult people. Paper don't lie, she used to say. The next few days were tense. Jerome half expected Victoria to show up with some complaint about his work, maybe trying to get him fired for imaginary problems with her aircraft. But she didn't come to the hangar at all. For a moment, Jerome hoped maybe she'd finally gotten the message and moved on. He should have known better. The following Monday, Rodriguez called Jerome into his office. His supervisor looked uncomfortable, which immediately put Jerome on edge. Have a seat, Rodriguez said, closing the door behind them. Jerome sat down, his stomach churning. He had a feeling this was about Victoria. I got a call this morning, Rodriguez began slowly. From Victoria Sterling's assistant. She wants to schedule a private meeting with you about some concerns she has with the maintenance work. Jerome felt his heart sink. What kind of concerns? She wouldn't say specifically, just that she wants to discuss some issues privately before deciding whether to file a formal complaint. Jerome knew this was Victoria's way of trying to get him alone, away from the safety of the busy hangar where other people could see and hear what was happening. Rodriguez, I need to tell you something, Jerome said. Ms. Sterling has been making me uncomfortable with personal advances. I've been professional and polite, but she won't take no for an answer. Rodriguez frowned. What kind of advances? Jerome pulled out his notebook and read through some of the incidents he'd documented. Rodriguez's frown deepened as he listened. This is serious, Jerome. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I kept hoping she'd get bored and move on, Jerome admitted. I didn't want to cause problems for the company. She spends a lot of money here. Money doesn't give anyone the right to harass my employees, Rodriguez said firmly. I'm going to call her assistant back and decline the private meeting. If she has legitimate maintenance concerns, she can discuss them here, with me present. Jerome felt a wave of relief. At least his supervisor was taking him seriously and had his back. But Victoria wasn't finished. 2 days later, she showed up at the hangar unannounced again. This time she waited until most of the other mechanics had gone to lunch, leaving Jerome working alone on a small aircraft in the back corner of the hangar. Jerome heard her heels clicking across the floor and looked up to see her approaching. She was dressed more casually than usual, expensive jeans and a silk blouse, but her expression was all business. Hello, Jerome, she said, stopping just a few feet away from where he was kneeling beside the aircraft's engine. Ma'am, Jerome said, standing up but staying close to his work area. He glanced around, noting that they were relatively isolated from the rest of the hangar. I think we got off on the wrong foot the other day, Victoria said, her voice smooth and controlled. I may have been a bit forward. I just find you very interesting. Jerome kept his face neutral. I appreciate that, but as I've said before, I prefer to keep things professional. Of course, Victoria said, stepping closer. But surely there's no harm in two adults having a conversation. She moved closer still, close enough that Jerome had to step back to maintain comfortable distance. But his back hit the aircraft, leaving him nowhere to go. I've been thinking about you, Victoria continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. About how strong you are, how capable. I bet you could handle anything. Jerome felt trapped, literally backed against the plane with Victoria standing too close. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been trying to avoid. Ma'am, I need you to step back, please, Jerome said firmly. Instead of stepping back, Victoria reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch felt wrong, invasive, and Jerome immediately pulled away. Don't touch me, Jerome said, his voice harder than before. Victoria looked genuinely surprised, as if she couldn't believe someone would reject her physical contact. I'm just being friendly, she said, but there was an edge of annoyance in her voice. No, you're not, Jerome said, moving sideways to get out from being trapped against the aircraft. You're making me uncomfortable, and I've asked you repeatedly to stop. Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by cold anger. Do you have any idea who I am? She demanded. What I could do for you? The doors I could open? I don't want any doors opened, Jerome said. I just want to do my job without being harassed. The word harassed seemed to hit Victoria like a slap. Her face flushed red. Harassed? She repeated, her voice rising. I've been nothing but generous to you. I've brought you gifts, offered you opportunities, tried to include you in my social circle. And this is how you repay my kindness? Jerome stared at her, amazed by her complete lack of self-awareness. She genuinely seemed to believe that her unwanted attention was some kind of favor she was doing for him. Ma'am, your attention is not welcome, Jerome said as clearly as he could. I have asked you politely multiple times to leave me alone. You have ignored those requests and continued to pursue me despite my obvious discomfort. That is harassment. Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. You think you're too good for me? Some mechanic from the projects thinks he can reject Victoria. Sterling? The way she said some mechanic from the projects made Jerome's jaw clench. There was pure contempt in her voice, the attitude of someone who looked down on working people as beneath her notice. This has nothing to do with thinking. I'm too good for anyone, Jerome said, fighting to keep his voice level. This is about respect and appropriate boundaries. Something you clearly don't understand. Victoria stepped closer again, her face twisted with anger and wounded pride. You're making a big mistake, she said quietly. I could ruin you. One phone call from me and you'll never work in this industry again, do you understand me? There it was, the naked threat Jerome had been expecting. Victoria was showing her true colors now, the entitled billionaire who thought her money gave her the right to treat people however she wanted. Jerome looked down at this woman who had everything money could buy, but clearly lacked basic human decency. He thought about his grandmother who had raised him to stand up for himself while treating everyone with respect. He thought about his co-workers who looked up to him. He thought about what kind of man he wanted to be. Ma'am, Jerome said, his voice steady and strong. I'd rather lose my job than lose my self-respect. You can make all the threats you want, but my answer will always be the same. I am not interested in you personally, and I never will be. Victoria's face went white with rage. For a moment, Jerome thought she might actually try to hit him. Instead, she stepped back, her hands shaking with fury. You have no idea what you've just done, she said, her voice trembling. No idea at all. She turned and stormed out of the hangar, her expensive heels clicking angrily against the concrete floor. Jerome stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. He'd finally said what needed to be said, but he knew there would be consequences. Victoria Sterling wasn't the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything that had just happened, including her explicit threats. Whatever came next, he wanted to be prepared. Jerome looked at the aircraft he'd been working on, then at his tools scattered around the workstation. This job meant everything to him, but some things were more important than any job. His grandmother had been right all those years ago when she told him that a man's character was measured not by what he could gain, but by what he was willing to sacrifice to do the right thing. Jerome didn't sleep well that night. He kept replaying the confrontation with Victoria in his mind, wondering if he'd made the right choice. Part of him worried that maybe he should have just put up with her behavior to protect his job. But every time he thought about backing down, he remembered the look of entitled rage on her face when he'd refused to be intimidated. The next morning, Jerome arrived at work early, as usual. He wanted to get his tools organized and mentally prepare for whatever Victoria might throw at him. But before he could even start working, Rodriguez appeared at his workstation with a serious expression. "Jerome, I need you to come to the office. We need to talk." Jerome's stomach dropped. This was it. Victoria had made good on her threat, and he was about to lose his job. In the office, Rodriguez closed the door and gestured for Jerome to sit down. To Jerome's surprise, there was another man in the room, someone he didn't recognize wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. "Jerome, this is Mr. Patterson from our corporate legal department," Rodriguez explained. "I called him after you told me about the situation with Miss Sterling." Jerome looked back and forth between the two men, confused. "Legal department?" Mr. Patterson opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Jerome, what you've described constitutes workplace harassment, and we take that very seriously. I've reviewed your documentation, and we believe you have a strong case." Jerome felt a wave of relief wash over him. They weren't firing him. They were taking his side. "I called Ms. Sterling's office this morning," Rodriguez continued. "I informed them that she is no longer welcome at our facility and that we'll be referring her future business to one of our competitors." Jerome's eyes widened. "You fired her as a client? We don't tolerate harassment of our employees. Period," Rodriguez said firmly. "I don't care how much money someone has or how important they think they are. You're part of our team and we protect our team." Mr. Patterson leaned forward. "Jerome, I want you to know that if Ms. Sterling tries to retaliate against you in any way, if she tries to damage your reputation in the industry or interfere with your employment, we'll take immediate legal action. We have everything documented, including witness statements from your co-workers who observed her inappropriate behavior." Jerome felt emotion welling up in his chest. He'd been so worried about standing up for himself, afraid that no one would believe him or support him. But here were his supervisor and the company's legal team ready to go to bat for him. "Thank you," Jerome said, his voice slightly hoarse. "I was worried that nobody would believe me, or that I'd lose my job for refusing. Too, you know." "Jerome," Rodriguez said, "I've been in this business for 20 years. I've seen how some wealthy clients think they can treat service workers. It's never okay, and it's not part of anyone's job description to put up with that kind of behavior." Mr. Patterson handed Jerome a business card. "If Ms. Sterling contacts you directly, by phone, email, text, anything, I want you to call me immediately. Don't respond to her. Just forward everything to me." As it turned out, Victoria didn't contact Jerome directly, but she did try to cause problems for him in other ways. 3 days later, Rodriguez got a call from another aviation service company across town. Victoria had apparently told them that Premier Aviation had done shoddy work on her aircraft, and that Jerome, specifically, was incompetent and possibly dangerous. "She's trying to poison the well," Rodriguez told Jerome. "Good thing I've known those guys for years and they know the quality of our work. They laughed when she tried to badmouth you." Word of Victoria's behavior started spreading through the small aviation community. It turned out Jerome wasn't her first victim. 2 other service companies came forward with similar stories about inappropriate behavior toward their employees. One had quietly stopped taking her business months earlier, but hadn't said anything publicly. "Rich people like that think the rules don't apply to them," explained Tony, a mechanic from another shop who stopped by to share his story. "They think they can treat working folks however they want because we need the money. But you stood up to her, man. That takes guts." Jerome was surprised by how much support he received from his co-workers and others in the industry. Danny, who had initially thought Jerome was crazy for rejecting Victoria's advances, came up to him with an apology. "I didn't understand before," Danny said. "I thought you were just being stubborn, but my wife explained it to me. She said if some rich old man was harassing her at work and offering her gifts and making comments about her body, I'd want to punch the guy." "It's the same thing, isn't it?" "Exactly the same thing," Jerome confirmed. Word also got back to Jerome's family about what had happened. His grandmother was proud, but not surprised. "I raised you right," she said, when Jerome visited her that weekend. "Your grandfather would have been proud too. Some things are more important than money, and self-respect is at the top of that list." But the story didn't end with Victoria just going away. About a month after the confrontation, Jerome heard through the industry grapevine that Victoria was facing some serious problems. Apparently, her pattern of inappropriate behavior toward service workers had finally caught up with her. Several employees from different companies had come forward with similar stories. A high-profile business magazine picked up the story, and it became a scandal in the tech world. Victoria's company's stock price dropped, and several major business partners started distancing themselves from her. Jerome felt no satisfaction in her downfall. He hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's life. He just wanted to be left alone to do his job. But he understood that sometimes bullies only stop when they face real consequences for their actions. The most unexpected development came 6 months later. Jerome was working on a routine maintenance job when Rodriguez approached him with a big smile. "Got some news for you," Rodriguez said. "Corporate wants to promote you to lead technician for the luxury aircraft division." Jerome nearly dropped his wrench. "Lead technician? They've been watching your work and they're impressed, not just with your technical skills, but with how you handled the situation with Sterling. They want someone with integrity leading that team." The promotion came with a significant pay raise and more responsibility. Jerome would be overseeing a team of 5 mechanics and handling the most complex aircraft repairs. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez added with a grin. "The company is implementing new policies about client conduct, partly based on what happened with you. Every employee will get training on how to recognize and report harassment, and we're making it crystal clear to all clients what kind of behavior is and isn't acceptable." Jerome felt a sense of pride he'd never experienced before. By standing up for himself, he'd not only protected his own dignity but potentially helped protect future employees from similar situations. A year later, Jerome was thriving in his new role. His team respected him. His skills had grown tremendously, and he was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible when he first started at the company. More importantly, he'd learned something valuable about himself. He'd discovered that he was stronger than he'd known, not just physically but mentally and morally. When faced with a choice between compromising his values and standing up for what was right, he'd chosen correctly. Jerome's grandmother had always told him that a person's true character shows when they're under pressure. Looking back on the whole experience, Jerome was proud of the character he'd shown. He still worked on luxury aircraft, still dealt with wealthy clients, but now he did so with the confidence that came from knowing his company and his colleagues had his back, and more importantly, he had his own back. The expensive jewelry Victoria had tried to give him still sat in Rodriguez's office, safe, unclaimed. Sometimes Jerome wondered if they should donate it to charity or return it to her, but Rodriguez said they'd keep it as evidence just in case. Jerome never thought about Victoria Sterling anymore. He was too busy building the life and career he wanted, based on his own hard work and integrity, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. On quiet afternoons in the hangar, when Jerome was training a new mechanic or solving a particularly challenging problem, he sometimes remembered his grandmother's words, "Paper don't lie, and neither does a man who knows his worth." Jerome knew his worth now, and nobody would ever make him forget it again.